Sometimes the author tells you the unity of his plan in his preface. Sometimes author tells you the unity of his book in unity of his plan in his preface. In this respect, expository books differ radically from fiction. In this respect, expository books differ radically from fiction. A scientific or a philosophical writer has no reason to keep you in suspense. A scientific, how does it differ from the fiction? A scientific or a philosophical author has no reason to keep you in suspense. In fact, the less suspense he keeps you in, the more likely you are to sustain the effort of reading his work through. In fact, less suspense he keeps you in, the more likely you are to sustain the effort of reading his work through. More likely you are to sustain the effect of reading his work through. In fact, the less suspense he keeps you in, more effort you are to sustain. More likely you are to sustain the effort of reading his book through. That is complete. The effort of reading book through. So to tell again, in fact, the less suspense he keeps you in, more likely you are to sustain the effort. You are to sustain the effort of reading his work or reading book through. Like a newspaper article, sustain the effort. You have to sustain means like complete the effort. I mean, he'll bear the effort of going your work through, because he knows it's less suspense. Like a newspaper article, an expository book may summarize itself in its first paragraph. Like a newspaper article, expository book may summarize itself in the first paragraph. Do not be too proud to accept the author's help if he proffers it. But do not rely too completely on what he says in the preface either. Do not be too proud to accept the author's help if he proffers it. What is the meaning of proffer? I think we'll come to that later. I'm not sure. Do not be too proud to accept the author's help if he pre-offers it. Like proffer is pre-offer? No. Do not be too proud to accept the author's help if he proffers it, but do not rely too completely on what he says in the preface either. Neither dot, no. Don't be proud, don't rely either. The best laid plans of author is like those of mice and other men often go awry. The best laid plan of authors, like those of mice and other men, often go awry. Be guided by the prospectus the author gives you. Be guided by the prospectus the author gives you. Prospectus is the summary or the brochure kind of thing. It's like it has a small section that describes everything. Be guided by the prospectus that author gives you. But always remember that the obligation of finding unity belongs finally to the reader as much as the obligation of having one belongs to the writer. But always remember the obligation of finding the unity of book belongs finally to the reader as much as the obligation of having one belongs to the writer. So it's as much as the obligation of having unity belongs to the author as well as to the reader, the obligation of finding one. You discharge that obligation honestly only by reading the whole book. You can discharge that obligation only by reading the whole book. So if you own a book, you're in an obligation. If you bought a book, you're in an obligation to find the unity of that book as much as the obligation belongs to the author of having one. Obligation of having one belongs to author. You can discharge that obligation. You can get rid of, like, it's a promise kind of. You can discharge the obligation only by reading the book honestly, or only by you can discharge the obligation honestly only by reading the whole book. The introductory paragraph of Herodotus' history of the war between Greeks and Persians provides an excellent summary of the whole. The introductory paragraph of Herodotus, the history of the war between Greek and Persian, provides an excellent summary of the whole. Summary of the whole. It runs, these are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. These are the research of the Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which he publishes in the scope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and of preventing the great and wonderful action of the Greeks and barbarians from losing their due meed of glory, and withal to put on record what were grounds of feud. It doesn't just describe what happened between two countries, also the reason. So these are the researches of Hercules, which he publishes. I'll say, I'm just replacing the name Herodotus because it's too complicated to say. These are the researches of the Herodotus, which he publishes in the hope of thereby by writing it, it's just a hope. I mean, it's a funny sentence, right? We can say thereby, but he says in the hope of, because he's not exactly sure it'll happen. He hopes thereby. This entire sentence like goes to thereby. What is the research of Herodotus? Thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done. Thereby, in the hope of thereby preserving the decay the remembrance of what men have done. thereby preserving the decay, the remembrance of what men have done, and preserving the great and wonderful what men have done, preserving the decay, the remembrance of what men have done, and of preserving the great and wonderful actions of Greek and barbarians from being losing their due meed of glory, and withal to put on record what were the ground of feud.